Hey there, I'm Joey from EDH Rec, and today I'd like to help you sort out a sorting problem. A long time ago on the EDH Rec podcast, we had an episode all about the various categories of cards in your deck, and I'd like to revisit that topic again today because, well, every so often I see a deck list online that looks like this. Basically, a deck list that is pretty far-flung, pretty scattered. Things are organized into categories, but they're hard to track. Now, this is just an example layout. It's inspired by lists I've seen online. I'm not trying to throw any specific person under the bus here. And ultimately, if this is a brewing method that works for you, then power to you. But I know it's not a brewing method that works for me. I definitely want to sort cards not just by their card types, but by the roles that they fulfill within the deck, but this is a little too hyper-specific for me. I kind of lose track of how the deck is intended to function. With this video, my goal is to help you get better at playing your commander deck, not just by practicing with it, but just in the brewing stage, because the simple act of organizing a deck's categories can help us achieve a greater understanding of how to successfully meet the demands of that deck strategy. So, where do we begin? To start off, I bet a lot of people are familiar with the Command Zone stats breakdowns whenever they review and upgrade pre-constructed decks. They often use the classic categories of lands, ramp, card draw, targeted removal, board wipes, and cards that relate to the unique theme of your deck, such as elves in an elf deck or artifacts in an artifact deck. This is a fantastic way to break things down, and one of the things that I appreciate most about approaches like this one is that there aren't a lot of categories total. It's really focused. There are a relatively small number of jobs that the deck is tasked with doing. Now, some cards may fit into multiple categories at once, we'll get to that in a moment, but overall, perhaps the biggest thesis of this video is that I think it's very important to streamline a deck's categories, because at the end of the day, there aren't actually 100 different things that you need your deck to do. There aren't even 20 different things that you need a deck to do. There are just a couple of core things that you can commit to that will make sure that your deck flourishes. Take that example deck list from earlier that I showed and compare this to this. I personally find this layout easier to navigate. This here is actually my Thalisse deck, and as you can see, I have a relatively slim number of categories in it. In addition to my commander and my lands, I have a mana acceleration column and a card advantage column, an interaction column, more on that one later, and on the far end, token makers and a section that I've labeled as oomph, because I think it's funny, but that's basically my win conditions section, the things that help close out the game. Now, I find this a much easier way to parse a deck list, but I bet there will be a lot of folks who don't really gel with it. And honestly, that's fair enough, especially if folks are worried that maybe it's a little too oversimplified. If this doesn't track for you, then that's totally cool. Find and stick to one that does track for you. But for myself at least though, here's why honing things down and streamlining them to this degree and making it this simple actually does feel pretty good to me. For instance, take that oomph category, the win conditions section, which contains cards like Nadir's Nightblade, which can drain opponents, as well as cards that will pump up my tokens, or cards that double the number of them. Now, I could have separated these into different sections, because ostensibly they each do different things, but ultimately, boiling them down to their most significant function, these cards are just 3 different approaches to the same end goal, knocking opponents out with my tokens. Either they drain life totals with them, or they make some of the tokens so big that they'll hit for lethal, or they make so many tokens that I'll overwhelm the board. There are 3 different paths all going up the same mountain. So I group them together because even though they have different gradients to them, they all fit under the same umbrella, the same mission. In much the same way, I wouldn't feel compelled to draw a really big distinction between mana accelerants that get more lands into play versus mana accelerants that come in the form of a traditional mana rock versus accelerants that come in the form of making treasure tokens. I would just call all of them mana acceleration. Maybe some of them will have more direct synergy with a given deck's mission. Land searchers would be stronger in a deck with landfall cards, for instance, but they all serve the same role, and grouping them like that helps me make comparisons between them. I think it's also the case that the names we use for our labels can be important during this process too. As a kind of nitpicky example, I called one of my sections card advantage earlier, rather than calling it card draw, and I do so because some of the spells out there that I play in various decks, such as Ren's Resolve or Mystic Forge, don't explicitly draw cards, but they do give you access to more cards than what you had before. I wouldn't want to put Night's Whisper in a card draw category while putting Ren's Resolve in a different impulse draw category. Applying a broader label to my advantage section helps me better get in tune with different things that will give me more cards that I can cast. It's not useful for me to get hung up on the particulars, because I think if I did that, it would mean that I'm missing the forest for the trees. The important thing really is zooming out and viewing things for their broader purpose, because those umbrella categories are an important lens through which to look at a deck, and to better understand what its mission is and how to go about executing it. Honing those categories can mentally adjust the way that you approach that deck. After all, what's more important, that your pair of boots is an equipment, or that your pair of boots is used to protect your commander? Having better understandings of those labels and those categories can improve your gameplay while you are piloting that deck. We want to see beyond just the mere text that is on a card. For some bigger examples of this, let's take the card Forever Young. The explicit text of this card is to get a bunch of creatures back from your graveyard on top of your library, and then you'll draw one of them so you can get one of those creatures back into your hand. If I was to only label this card by its literal purpose, I'd probably have to label it as recursion or something like that. But the deck that I play this card in is my Conrad deck, and in that deck, it's not truly a recursion spell. It's a burn spell. When I cast this with my commander in play, I'm extracting 10 plus creatures from my yard to deal that much damage, and I'm setting up my library for Conrad to mill even more creatures and deal even more damage. This is an endgame card, not a recursion spell. Or heck, let's use the card Zurin Orb from my Titania deck. On its face, Zurin Orb is a life gain spell, technically, but in actual practical application, it's a card that I use to create dozens of elemental tokens. When I put Zurin Orb into my deck, I don't have it labeled as a thing that fills the graveyard or a thing that gives me life. I have it labeled as a token maker. And just by doing things like labeling Zurin Orb as a token maker or Forever Young as an endgame burn spell, I know not to cast them early as value pieces. I know to sandbag them, saving them for when I'm going to deal tons of damage later on in the game. This is an especially useful lesson for players out there using counterspells. I've seen lots of people label counterspells as removal, but are they? If you're using them proactively to keep an enemy card off the board, then yeah, that makes sense. But if you're using them to defend your own board state, that's kind of a different function, and that type of changed viewpoint is really important. When I noticed that in my own play patterns, I basically only ever used counterspells to protect my own cards from other people's removal spells, that's when I switched those counterspells over to other cheaper options. Stubborn Denial, for example, was narrower, but for the purpose that I was using that card slot, which was, in practice, exclusively to protect my board, that saved me a mana every single time. It was more efficient at that task. And we've mentioned some other counterspell examples on the show before too. Spell Swindle, Access Denied, Overwhelming Intellect. When we view these cards through the lens of them being counterspells, these are much clunkier than other options that are out there. But when we're sorting these cards in our deck lists, instead of lumping them into a counterspell category, what if we label, for example, Access Denied in a Token Maker category instead? A Token Maker that also happens to counter a spell. Now it starts to feel like a different conversation, and instead of comparing it to other counterspells, we're comparing that rate to other methods of token creation in this color. And that gives me a better sense of how to treat this card in my deck. That gives me a better sense of how valuable it is, and a better sense of when and how I'll cast it. Plus, as an added benefit, when I categorize cards like Forever Young amongst my other win conditions in my Conrad deck, that can also help out anyone else who's looking over my deck list and help them make the same connection with how that card will be used for that deck. That way they won't have a misunderstanding about what the card's function really is, and won't tell me to cut it, for example. Like, if I'm asking a friend for help editing my deck list, illuminating those connections will help them give me better deck advice. Not only that, but I think this method of honing categories helps us better recognize outliers in a deck. Things that don't fit in with the same mission as the other necessary components of that list, and which therefore might be eligible as a thing to cut when making room for new cards. And that's something I really appreciate about being strict with our categories here. I know I appreciate anything that helps make the process of cutting cards easier to do. Of course, this brings us to cards which fulfill multiple functions and which could fit into multiple categories. Modal spells, for instance, are famously versatile, and it can be tough to know where you should even place them, because they don't just do one thing. I have Elspeth in my Thalisse deck, for instance, and she's both a board wipe and a token generator. I play Ayara in my Conrad deck, and she can function as both a source of steady card advantage and as a win condition when I get tons of bodies into play. But as it happens, this is something you can emulate on deck building tools like Architect, where you can have cards in multiple different categories to help you track their various purposes throughout your deck. In my Virtus deck, for instance, I can label Golgari Charm as both a protection spell and as a removal spell. I encourage folks to try this out and see how approaching the categories of their decks in a new way affects the way that they think about those cards. That's ultimately the point I'm trying to make, that the lens you use affects how you see and play your deck. And let's try this theory out right now. I mentioned the interaction column in my Thalys deck earlier, which, as you can see, groups some very interesting types of cards together. Pinpoint removal is grouped together with board wipes, which are also alongside things like fogs and board protection spells. Why did I group all these together? Aren't protection spells and board clearing spells literally opposites? Well, technically, yeah, but by putting them into the same category like this, we are kind of forced to think about them a little bit differently and see what they do have in common. And in this case, the thing that they all have in common comes down to one word: survival. This is a staying alive section. From pinpoint removal spells to board wipes to phasing things away, these cards are all deployed in the same types of situations. To stop other players from knocking me out. Either I remove their stuff to stop them from taking over the board and killing me and all my stuff, or I use protective spells to stop people from killing me and all my stuff. When I zoom out and look at the times that these cards are cast, and the ramifications that happen when they resolve, they're each there to swing bad game scenarios back in my favor. Plus, if I can protect my stuff enough, I might be able to knock out other opponents myself, and KOing an opponent is a great way to get rid of their stuff. As they say, sometimes the best creature removal is player removal. In all seriousness, that example might be too much of an oversimplification for a lot of folks out there, and honestly, fair enough. The point that I'm trying to make here is not that this is the best way to group cards together in a deck list or whatever. Really, I just want to try and highlight that grouping cards together in different ways can reframe the way that you understand them. So if you want to level up your gameplay, be willing to break away from the things that you've always done. Break a little from the tradition of how you've always grouped cards together, because trying out some of those unusual things could potentially forge some new circuits together in your brain. All right, there's one final thing I want to do while I'm here talking about categories, and it's fitting that I saved it for the end because I think it's worthwhile for us to talk about how to give your deck a little more oomph. It's the classic Brago problem, right? Or Muldrotha problem, or Enchantress problem. You know, a Brago deck doesn't just want a category labeled blink targets. A common habit of brewers, especially when we're making a new deck, is that we'll get caught up in the synergy parts of a deck. All these amazing ways for that commander to generate tons of value in a unique and cool way. But we might not focus quite as much on the end game, on the oomph of the deck, the way to close things down. Value isn't victory, after all. How is that deck planning to win? By asking that question, and more specifically, by creating a space in your deck list dedicated to win conditions or to that late game oomph, you place a value on that concept. You bestow importance to it. And if there are only 1 or 2 cards in that section, that might be a sign to check in with how reliable it actually is for you to find and play those endgame cards. And not only that, but it'll make you look critically at the win conditions you do have and see if maybe sometimes you want to vary up those win conditions in case there's something else you might prefer sometimes. I know we say it's about the journey and not about the destination, and I agree. I don't play Commander to win every game. I play Commander to have a great time with my friends and family. And I think that playing a deck that doesn't keep win conditions in mind will lead to games that aren't as enjoyable for all of us. So when I begin a deck, I like to keep the ending in mind so that I know where everything is going, rather than potentially getting lost in value along the way. Because, I mean, yeah, it's about the journey, not the destination. But at the same time, when I get onto a plane, I do want it to know where it's going to land, you know? And I think all this talk about endings means it's probably time for me to wrap up this video. Thinking more critically about the ways that you sort and categorize the cards in your deck can lead to a deeper understanding of how that deck plays. And I think making those connections will make you better at playing the deck before you even sit down to play it at your next game night. Let me know how you map out your deck lists and share any techniques or revelations that you've had with other folks in the comments. And until next time, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.